The impossible victory. Imagine a moment when the entire world believed one outcome was inevitable. A modern European army, armed with advanced rifles, artillery, and the confidence of an expanding empire, marched into Africa expecting another easy conquest. They had done it before. Across the continent, powerful kingdoms had fallen. Ancient civilizations were dismantled. Entire nations were divided by foreign powers who believed Africa belonged to them. To the rulers of Italy, this was supposed to be just another victory. Another flag planted. Another African nation erased from the map. But in the highlands of Ethiopia, something extraordinary was happening. Farmers laid down their tools. Warriors sharpened their spears. Nobles assembled armies. Priests carried sacred crosses. And people from every corner of the country answered a single call. Defend the nation. What happened next shocked the world. On March 1, 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, an African army did what many believed was impossible. It defeated a European empire. Not through luck. Not through miracle. But through strategy, unity, leadership, and an unbreakable determination to remain free. This was more than a military victory. It was a declaration to the world that Africa would not surrender without a fight. It inspired generations of freedom movements from Ghana to South Africa, from Kenya to Algeria. And at the center of this extraordinary story stood two remarkable leaders, Menelik II and Empress Taytu. Together, they led one of the most important victories in African history. A victory that changed the destiny of a continent. A victory that proved freedom is never given. It is defended. This is the story of the Battle of Adwa, the day Africa defeated a European empire, and showed the world that some nations cannot be conquered. Chapter 1. The Scramble for Africa and the Gathering Storm. By the late 19th century, a dangerous belief had taken hold in the capitals of Europe, that Africa was a prize to be claimed. Its lands could be divided. Its peoples could be ruled. Its kingdoms could be erased. In elegant rooms thousands of miles away, powerful men drew lines across maps they barely understood. They negotiated over territories they had never seen and over nations whose histories stretched back centuries. This period became known as the Scramble for Africa. Within a few decades, much of the continent was seized by European powers including Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, and Italy. To many in Europe, this expansion was portrayed as progress. But for Africans, it often meant invasion, forced labor, and the destruction of sovereignty. One of the defining moments of this era was the Berlin Conference. Representatives of European powers met in Berlin to establish rules for dividing Africa. No African leaders were invited. No African voices were heard. The future of an entire continent was discussed without the consent of its people. Maps were redrawn. Borders were imagined. Empires expanded. But one nation stood apart. High in the mountains of Ethiopia, an ancient civilization remained independent. Its rulers traced their legitimacy through centuries of statehood. Its churches preserved traditions that stretched back to antiquity. Its people were deeply committed to defending their land. Ethiopia was not isolated from the world. It traded, negotiated, and adapted. And its leaders understood the threat that was approaching. Among the powers seeking a foothold in Africa, Italy was particularly determined to build an empire. As a newly unified nation, Italy wanted prestige and overseas territories to match the larger European powers. It had already established a presence in Eritrea along the Red Sea. From there, Italian officials looked south toward Ethiopia. They believed the country could be brought under their control through diplomacy, pressure, and if necessary, war. What they failed to understand was that Ethiopia was preparing. Its future emperor, Menelik II, was a patient strategist. He studied world politics. He acquired modern weapons. He strengthened alliances among regional leaders. And he recognized that independence would require both wisdom and resolve. Beside him stood Empress Taytu, a formidable political leader in her own right. She understood the intentions of foreign powers and argued fiercely against concessions that threatened Ethiopian sovereignty. Together, they saw what many others did not. A storm was coming. Across Africa, One kingdom after another was falling under colonial rule. But in Ethiopia, leaders and citizens were making a different choice. They would not accept domination. They would not surrender their independence. And if war became unavoidable, they would fight with everything they had. Europe believed the conquest of Africa was inevitable. History was about to prove otherwise. The rise of Menelik II. Before the world knew his name as the man who would reshape Ethiopia's destiny, Menelik was simply a prince navigating a complex and divided land. Ethiopia in the 19th century was not a simple, unified state. It was a collection of powerful regions, noble families, and shifting alliances. Leadership was never guaranteed. It had to be earned, defended, and constantly secured. Menelik understood this from a young age. He did not rise in a peaceful environment. He rose in a world of political tension, internal rivalries, and external pressure from expanding European empires watching Africa closely. As he matured, Menelik developed a rare combination of patience and ambition. He was not only thinking about ruling a region, he was thinking about preserving a civilization. At the same time, European powers were increasing their presence around Ethiopia's borders. Weapons were becoming more advanced. Diplomacy was becoming more aggressive. And pressure was slowly building from every direction. Menelik's strength was not just military. It was strategic intelligence. He observed how other African regions were being weakened through division and unequal agreements. He understood that Ethiopia's survival depended on modernization, unity, and preparation. So he began to act. He strengthened internal alliances with regional leaders, carefully bringing powerful provinces closer under a shared national vision. He invested in modern weapons, ensuring that Ethiopia would not face future threats with outdated tools. He expanded diplomatic connections, learning how European powers operated on the global stage. But perhaps his most important strength was his understanding of time. He did not rush into conflict. He prepared for it. Every decision he made was shaped by one silent question: what will Ethiopia need to survive the coming storm? As his influence grew, so did his reputation. Some saw him as a unifier. Others saw him as a rising force that could challenge colonial ambitions in Africa. Yet Menelik was not acting alone in shaping Ethiopia's future. Beside him stood Empress Taytu, a leader whose intelligence and political instinct would prove just as critical as military strength. Together, they formed a partnership that balanced diplomacy, strategy, and resistance. And as pressure from outside powers increased, Menelik's role began to shift from regional ruler to national defender. He was no longer preparing for governance alone. He was preparing for survival. Because by the time the outside world fully understood Ethiopia's strength, it might already be too late. And the decisions Menelik made during this period would soon determine the fate of an entire continent. Empress Taytu and the mind behind the empire. If Menelik II represented patience and long-term vision, then Empress Taytu represented something sharper: awareness, strategy, and absolute political instinct. She was not a background figure in history. She was one of the most influential decision-makers in Ethiopia at a time when the survival of the nation was being tested from every direction. While European diplomats believed they were negotiating with a single ruler, Ethiopia was actually being guided by two minds working in alignment. Taytu understood something many around her underestimated. Power does not only come from weapons. It comes from knowing when to refuse pressure. As foreign influence increased along the borders of Ethiopia, diplomatic offers began to arrive. Some were framed as friendship, others as cooperation. But beneath the language, the goal was clear: control. One of the most dangerous moments came through a document known as the Treaty of Wuchale. To Italian officials, it appeared to give them influence over Ethiopia's foreign affairs. But in the Amharic version, it said something completely different. Taytu was among the first to recognize the danger. She did not see it as a misunderstanding. She saw it as a deliberate attempt to reduce Ethiopian sovereignty through language and diplomacy. Her response was not emotional. It was strategic resistance. She urged Menelik to reject any interpretation that weakened Ethiopia's independence. She pushed for clarity. She pushed for strength. and she pushed for preparation instead of compromise. At court, her influence grew. Some advisors preferred negotiation. Others feared confrontation. But Taytu consistently returned to one principle. If sovereignty is lost on paper, it will soon be lost on the battlefield. Her voice became essential in shaping Ethiopia's position. And as tensions increased with Italy, it was no longer just a diplomatic disagreement. It was becoming a confrontation that could not be avoided. Taytu also played a critical role in military preparation. She supported the gathering of resources, encouraged unity among regional leaders, and reinforced the idea that Ethiopia's strength came from collective resistance, not fragmented loyalty. Where others saw risk, she saw necessity. Where others saw delay, she saw danger. And as events moved closer toward open conflict, her influence ensured that Ethiopia did not enter the coming war unprepared or divided. She understood the truth clearly. The storm was not coming. It had already begun. Clapperboard Chapter 4. The Road to War. By the mid-1890s, tension between Ethiopia and Italy had moved beyond diplomacy. Italy, already established in Eritrea, believed it could extend its influence further into Ethiopian territory. But Ethiopia was no longer the fragmented region outsiders imagined. Under Menelik II, the country had been quietly preparing. Weapons were being modernized. Regional leaders were being unified. And communication networks were strengthening across the highlands. Italy, however, miscalculated. They believed Ethiopia was still politically divided and militarily weak compared to European armies. That belief would become one of the most costly assumptions in colonial history. As pressure increased, Ethiopian leadership made a final decision. They would not accept unequal control. They would not accept rewritten sovereignty. And they would not accept humiliation disguised as diplomacy. The path toward war became unavoidable, and both sides began preparing for a confrontation that would soon define history. Clapperboard Chapter 5. The Gathering Storm Before Adwa. As the final phase approached, Ethiopia moved with discipline and urgency. Thousands of fighters from different regions began assembling, not as isolated groups, but as a unified national force. This was not a small resistance. It was a coordinated national mobilization. At the same time, Italian forces advanced with confidence, expecting a quick campaign. But Ethiopia's terrain, unity, and intelligence network created a different reality. Supply lines became difficult. Communication became uncertain. And the assumptions of a quick victory began to collapse. By early 1896, both armies were positioned for what would become the defining confrontation. The Battle of Adwa was no longer a possibility. It was imminent. And in the mountains of Ethiopia, two realities were forming. One side believed they were about to expand an empire. The other side knew they were about to defend their existence. And when those two beliefs collided, history would be forced to change direction.